I think this brings me on to, I suppose, what strikes me as the great sort of, the thing that defines the two of them. In some ways that defines them, in terms of them. You could argue quite convincingly that they are certainly the two most significant English writers of the period in terms of impact and effect and sort of themes that they were discussing. But also, the other thing too is that Orwell admired, the one thing he admired of Waugh's was his actual physical courage. I mean, when Waugh joined a commando unit in 1941, Orwell said to Anthony Pym, why can't someone on the left do this? Why is it always the right-wing writers who are getting out there and fighting the Nazis while, as he put it, Auden is sitting on his arse in America, So, but what it strikes me that, we're both in our different ways, in different styles, biographers, but I think one thing that we possibly share in our approach to the writers we cover is that I'm certainly very interested, because I think it's a marvellously, not in all cases, but in some cases, a marvellously effective tool in sort of cracking the code of a writer's inner being. I'm fascinated by what I would call the personal myth in writers' lives. I mean, Anthony Pold, who was a great friend of both our subjects here, once remarked, I think it's in one of the volumes of Dance the Music Time, and Pold says that what happens to people in their lives is not really important. It's what they think happened to them, or what they think that other people think happens to them. So in other words, it's all a question of a sort of will perception of themselves. And certainly if you look at Waugh and Orwell, both seem to me to be, throughout their lives, and throughout their work too, throughout their novels, which we've been discussing, they seem to be quite consciously all the time projecting myths about themselves into the space above the book. I mean, what Orwell does, for example, in his 6 novels, and these are very different books, there are the 4 early novels written in the 30s. Then there's Animal Farm, which is this fable, this allegory of the revolution that failed. And then you've got 1984, which is this bitter, hallucinogenic, written when he was dying novel, a dystopian nightmare. But they're all essentially projections of Orwell. They're projections of a single, lonely, frightened person with the world, hemming them in, of friendless people wandering around in starkly sort of in the 1930s novels. The societies are not actually totalitarian, but Florey in Burmese Days, and Dorothy Hare in A Clergyman's Daughter, and Bowling to a certain extent, and Gordon Comstock, they are all presented as essentially friendless, or almost friendless, and alone. And the worlds they inhabit are projections of the worlds which Orwell himself inhabited when he was writing those novels. And yet Orwell himself was not friendless and was not being sort of hemmed in by the society about to crush him. And Winston Smith, I think, too, is simply another projection of Orwell, and Orwell's self-pity and the way in which Orwell regarded himself with the world around him. And I think Orwell, wouldn't you say that Waugh does the same?
I was going to ask you as well, David, about the women in Orwell's life, because one of the things that I was trying to do with, one of the things that struck me about Evelyn Waugh was that for all, and he has had a lot of bad press, and he's been sort of caricatured as some sort of
as Martin Amis would say, the worst press. You couldn't get much worse than some of the things.
You absolutely couldn't, and it just seemed to me, why would somebody so monstrous be beloved by such a wide circle of friends? And it seemed to me that particularly he had such strong women friends whom he helped become published, who he supported, physically sending checks to the Liggins themselves who fell on hard times. He was simply the most extraordinary and very, very loyal friend, and obviously invariably these sort of strong female types that he rather adored. And I don't really know much about the women in Orwell's life. Is there anything?
The women always, he was married for over 10 years.
She did all the typing, didn't she?
Who died. And Eileen Blair, his first wife, is a rather elusive figure, because until very recently we barely had a letter or a piece of writing by her. 2 or 3 years ago, several letters of hers turned up, and she comes across as the most sort of lively and vivacious, and sort of obviously kept Orwell together in a way that somebody needed. A woman needed to take an interest in Orwell, and she did. And when there are a lot of nonsense is peddled about him being completely unaffected by her death and going around telling friends that she was a good old stick, I suppose. But in fact, he was completely devastated when she died. He wandered around in sort of days, just proposing marriage to any woman he met, basically, and sort of he would sidle across to them at parties and whisper the immortal words, "Do you think you could take care of me?" Which was whereupon they would recoil in horror. And then, of course, there's Sonia, his second wife, who again, I said that a number of myths peddle about her as the gold digger who married him to his money. But in fact, when she married him, there wasn't a great deal of money, nor a particular prospect that there would be huge amounts. And again, it's the people who knew her closest, people like Stephen Spender and things like that, and women who'd worked with her on Horizon, said that she simply fancied herself as, the amanuensis, the help. There was this kind of rather picturesque vision that Orwell would recover his health to the sense that he could be what was called a good chronic, that they could go and live in a cottage in the country, and he could just work a few hours a day, and Sonia would keep the press from the door. And in fact, some of Orwell's friends, Pole and Muggeridge, after she married him, were sort of slightly taken aback by the sort of mildly officious, nursey manner that she adopted in the sequel. About no, Eric can't see you now, and no, you must. So I think it was no more than that. He certainly needed people who could because he was in some respects. In some ways, he was rather a practical person. In others, he was incapable of looking after himself. There was a famous story of when he and Eileen were living in Kilburn, I think in 1943, and she went out for the evening, leaving Orwell's shepherd's pie in the oven and some jellied eels on the floor for the cat. Orwell ate the jellied eels, and the shepherd's pie was found congealing in the oven 3 hours later. It's that sort of that level of abstraction, I suppose.
The other thing I probably would just also want to say, or perhaps end with, from my point of view, is that Orwell described Evelyn Waugh as the only discordant voice of his generation. And I think you mentioned something about physical courage, and Evelyn Waugh was the most incredibly courageous man, but he also wasn't afraid to speak out, and nor was Orwell, as we know from the P.G. Wodehouse debacle.
So which again, something else that drew them. In fact, drew them together. The first thing really that drew them together was Orwell's essay in defence of P.G. Wodehouse.
But I do love that, the only discordant voice of his generation. So that's the last thing I want to say, because I can see you're waving at me. Right,
perhaps
sorry, do you want to wrap it up?